Okay. Hello. I wanted to do a little addendum to the other learning theories video that I just recently made. I did not provide like a real clear description about the difference, at least the differences that I see, or I think I'm seeing, between critical constructivism and integrative constructivism. So, if you're thinking like, whoa, what's integrative constructivism? I'm going to go through that here. It's something that I've created to sort of keep moving the learning theories towards thriving and using the thriving theory that I've also been creating. So there's a lot of creating. This is what happens when you create a new paradigm by accident. You have a lot of work to do now. Anyway, all right. So in the last video, whether you saw it or not, I basically said that if you look at learning theories, more than just these two, what you see is a lot of learning being framed by keeping people in the exploited class. So just very quickly, the exploiter class, you can see there with the wealth distribution, they live a very different life and they're very dependent on the exploitation of the people who are basically in the 90th percentile and down, or 89th percentile and down, right? Thereabouts. There's a very different way in which the wealth is treated and so forth. So anyway, in the first video, I go through that a bit more, and I have other videos about talking about why it's important to look at class with this frame in mind rather than sort of the old school, poor, working class, middle class, upper middle class, and wealthy. That frame, I think, is problematic, and mainly because what I essentially think it comes down to is that there's these two classes. You have the group that's being exploited, and they're being exploited by the exploiters. Now, anybody would say, well, wait a second, anybody in the upper middle class, they're exploiting too. But they're generally not exploiting people for their labor directly, right? It's more because the system itself has that structure in place, whereas the exploiter class is the group that is really creating the whole structure and making sure the structure stays in place. So it's a different dynamic. Again, kind of another discussion for another day, but the point here is that the exploited class is a group that is basically the employee class versus the executive class. So I have descriptions around that. I'm using the same slides I used in the other video here, but just as a reminder, when you have this exploited class, when they're being raised and conditioned to think that success is becoming an upper tier exploited person, we have some real issues here. So this is something that I'm sort of working on, because what we do in school is tell folks who are poor that, and working middle class, poor working middle class as well, if you stick to it and you do all of your work and do your homework and show up and blah 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 blah, eventually you're gonna get good grades and graduate, go to college, and you're gonna get a decent job. Well, yeah, I suppose. The problem here is that when you're moving through the exploited class, as things are changing within exploited class. I'm not saying that everybody has the same exact experience, right? But basically, you're still part of the exploited class with a various shift in dimensions, but you're still being exploited by the executive class. Okay, again, another discussion for another day, and I have plenty of discussion around it in other videos. So to kind of get to the point here, learning theories have been framed very deliberately and explicitly to create workers, which means workers are people who have to get a lot of right answers in order to be somebody's employee and make the executive class richer, right? This is the exploited class is the group where their money makes them money. The exploited class is they don't even make enough money to cover their debts, right? And their debts keep compounding. So we have two very sort of like, another way of describing it is sort of the money makes money crowd and the debt crowd, right? There are two different crowds. The debt crowd, the exploited class, the employee consumer class, all the same thing, are just getting their lives, taken over from womb to tomb so that they can work for somebody else and make somebody else richer, right? This is an evolution from slavery. Like it's all that. We don't see it that way because we're not bound in the same way that people were during slavery. Granted, that's true, but we're overinflating our sort of positive view of what we're going through now. This is an exploited group, and the learning theories themselves have been shaped in that way. Okay, shaped to make employees. So students K through 12 or K through 16 are in a sort of pre-employee status, and we're constantly teaching them with the goal in mind of, how do you become somebody's successful employee, right? Again, John Taylor Gatto brought all this up many years ago, saying that public schools, are built to basically dumb people down, to keep them from actually being smart, critical people who understand the larger situations of society and power, and right that we're basically creating docile employees who are sort of dumbed down to that status, and that we're not allowed to really think beyond that sort of employee consumer status. And so the learning theories have really followed suit with that. Learning theories are aimed at keeping the bottom 90% of people just smart enough to be someone's employee, but not smarter than that. Okay? So, critical constructivism. Now, critical constructivism is based on critical pedagogy for the most part. Where I'm going with this is, if you go through the learning theory of critical constructivism, which is very loosely described in the literature, what you basically get is a version of something along these lines. Phase one, use prior knowledges, use prior experiences, they're tied to the community, and then you sort of explore what those are, and then you get into your curriculum, phase two, right? So you do this, longer, more meaningful experience for sure, and then of exploring and figuring out what you know and where it comes from and how it's connected to the community. And then you move into sort of your phase two-ish of the curriculum that we're all supposed to be teaching and learning, and then we do a critical analysis of that curriculum, right? So you can sort of see the constructivist pattern there, moving from prior knowledges, the critical layering of that to make it critical constructivism is to look at issues of power within the community, and sort of the historical and contemporary issues around those issues of power and privilege and wealth and so forth. Okay, so you sort of start with things being connected to the community, and then you reevaluate as you understand things more deeply. You do critical analysis of them in connection with the community too, using various lenses of analyses. So critical for the most part, right? Looking at issues of race and class. Certainly you can bring in feminist analysis and anti-heteronormative analysis. And anyway, so you look at, if you're doing it in a community-based way, which you may or may not be. Like, critical constructivism isn't very explicit about it being community-based, but at this point, all right. But what it is doing is sort of saying that there's a cultural construction around what we're learning and how we're learning it, right? So that can, be, I think, we can at the very least, sort of benefit of the doubt, implying things. It should be community based, right? It should connect back to the community. There's certainly discussion around it happening that way, right? But it's critical constructivism as a theory, a learning theory itself, a standalone learning theory, is not as explicit and prescriptive as some of the other learning theories are. And again, that's by intention. Critical pedagogy is not meant to be prescriptive because then it sort of embeds itself within these power dynamics once again, right? Okay, so where do we end? What's the end point of critical constructivism? Well, the end point is more along the lines of getting students to think divergently with these sort of power analyses at hand. So an individual student should be able to identify the ways in which some established information is situated within the communities. How do the communities think about it? What are the diversity of ways that they're thinking about these issues and how it connects to the content? And that's kind of about it, right? In terms of a learning theory itself, there is no other place really to go other than having these critical divergent understandings. Okay, like listen, compared to traditional education, that is positive movement, and I applaud that. That's good, right? So as I was continuing to think about these issues, and for years I used this as a base. I've been teaching learning theories now since I don't know, the mid 2000s, in some way, shape, or form. Really, very overtly since 2008. So it's been a long time. It's 13 years minimum. So it's only recently that I've sort of come around to, I felt like, okay, better, but still not quite there. And I felt that for years, not really putting together where that gap in my mind was, not really having a frame to look at, having this sort of ongoing blind spot within my own thinking. Okay, so where do we go from here, right? This seems pretty good. It seems good to have students be, sort of have a critical fluency, a critical literacy, right? That they're able to sort of very fluently and with high levels of literacy examine what's going on in their world. That's a good thing. Absolutely, yes. So this is not like an open critique of oh, I hate this stuff. This is like this is good, but I've always been thinking that there's something missing in the way that I think about it. Okay, and I will also take note on the fact that this is not the only way I think that people think about critical constructivism when they do think about it. But for me, I kind of think of it this way, and I needed to have some structure around it, not in a deeply prescriptive way, but just in a structured way so I can kind of understand what its movements are and how it works. Okay, so this is where I think critical constructivism is more or less. So let's apply that to what I've been applying it to in other videos, which is how to teach it to a specific content. So what would that look like teaching with critical constructivism, teaching about the content of the structure of the cell, cell organelles. I was a science teacher in middle school, taught cell organelles on a pretty regular basis. So what would that look like, applying critical constructivism to the content that is sort of the very traditional content of cell organelles and cellular biology, right? So, one, the core teaching philosophy would be like existentialism, critical race theory, feminism, equal justice, and then theories of sustainability. All those things would sort of happily fit within a very broad interpretation of critical pedagogy and critical constructivism. And I know people have really, done more of a microscopic view and looked at the ways in which critical pedagogy has been limiting and patriarchal and so forth. Perhaps not intending to be so, but sometimes having those qualities, for sure, right? And I'm, sort of aware. I'm not intending to gloss over them because I have my own issues with it, the way that it's been constructed. So let me just get to those. All right. So the core teaching methods could be things like students will examine cancer clusters, Tuskegee, research ethics, Henrietta Lacks, Rachel Carson, Barbara McClintock, and Rosalind Franklin, right? Looking at issues of patriarchy and science research. Um, the students will compare the structure and function of a healthy lung cell with a cancerous lung cell, and they'll research consumer-based practices that lead to cancers. All of that would be a pretty decent critical application to what would normally be a pretty decontextualized, disconnected content for most students. It's interesting to see a cell under the microscope, and that's about your only real world connection that you're going to get. Okay, so far so good, right? So the core assessments could be students. They do have a test, right? Perhaps, maybe not. Critical might sort of push back against that and say go someplace else. Fine, whatever. But on some level, you gotta just check in and see that students do have a basic understanding of the the organelles and their functions and so forth. So maybe it's not a test, but you're assessing in other ways to see that the students have that. Okay, cool. Now, if you're going to do and start to look into larger projects of like community and cellular health, you want to have that kind of um, background, right? You want to have a rigorous understanding of the content. So there's nothing wrong with that. So now, in real terms, what this is a preparation for some real world issues, especially issues of inequities for sure. Things like sort of eco-racism that lead to cancer clusters and lead in water that creates neurological disorders and so forth. Right? There's a lot here that we can get into based on the various ways in which injustices and power differentials and so forth, that which critical cares for, applies at the cellular level. So that's a good thing. All right. So doing the critical analysis would and then sort of sharing the critical analysis would be the endpoint here, right? Whether it's critical analysis of female cellular biologists and the treatment of them throughout history and what they've gone through and what their contributions have been that have been quite substantial. Somebody like Rachel Carson, for instance, huge, right? Undeniable. Well, except to patriarchy, but overall framework here for thriving is what I think is the next step, and which is why I think we get into at least another iteration of constructivism, if not something entirely different, to be perfectly honest. But I'll use a constructivist base as I'm going through this. All right, so if you're not geeking out on this just yet, let me know, because this is like we're definitely like in the land of deep in the weeds with education and so forth. Okay, let me get to this. I've talked about this before, so feel free whenever I say it, just feel free to check out other videos where I go into a bit more detail. But a summary version of this is thriving as a theory would be looking at issues of obviously social and ecological sustainability, how they're interacting with each other, and how our individual well-being is interacting with all that. A very basic concept is that when people are able to create more sustainable communities, it affects them positively, which then affects more sustainability in a positive direction, right? There's a very positive feedback cycle that seems to appear when we really pay attention to this with an integrative mindset, paying attention to how all of these dynamics are related to one another. So the the United Nations World Health the United Nations World Happiness Report. There we go. It's an annual report, and if you look at the top 20 countries there's a lot of the same countries that are in the annual EPI, which is a Environmental Performance Index. There we go. And that one looks at sustainability. And again, the top 20 countries there are almost they're not exactly, but they're darn close to being the same top 20 countries from the happiness report. Now that to me is really intriguing. We should see that correlation with a high level of importance, right? There's something going on there. So it tends to be about 16 or 17 countries are all within the top 20 of both of those annual reports. Interesting, right? Is one causing the other? Well, you you got to look deeper into that and see what those dynamics are. So using that as a framework of thinking, just pointing out the issues of the power differentials, the injustices, and so forth, which is what critical would have us do, is not, in my view, it's just a start. It's an important start, but it's not enough. Like I've always wanted to go a little bit further than just that, which isn't to say that that's unimportant. It's extremely important, and it's the base for change, which I think is why, we've been looking at it for decades now. So if not longer, I mean, I would say we've been looking at it at least since W.E.B. Du Bois. So there's at least a century, if not more, of thinking about just the injustices themselves. So if you move your large target of education from creating an employee to looking at injustices, so here's where my question has been, right? By virtue of just looking at the injustices themselves, do we get here, what you're looking at on the screen right now? Do we get to a place where we have thriving happening? Now, thriving is a somewhat idealistic term, granted, but I'll just go, with something that's moving towards thriving, or at least, better than what we have now. I'll accept that. That's fine. So I don't want to nail this word down like it has to be so structured, but yeah, I mean, the basic question here is what I just said. Are we at a thriving status when we're just pointing out and being aware of what the problems are? No, of course not, right? And I think anybody who is sort of deep in critical pedagogy would also say, like, that's, of course not, right? It's a step in the right direction, but we're not there yet. And so I've been trying to figure out what that there yet actually is. Okay, so how does that change the learning theory itself? Again, so we've moved the goalpost once from the more traditional theories to just become this sort of upper tier exploited worker. There you go. There's your social justice. Hope you enjoy that. To the okay, you're doing a critical analysis. Okay, that's a good thing. And I still sort of wonder, like, to what end is critical pedagogy saying? I know it's not, right? But it's so ill-defined, at least in my mind. Maybe somebody else can jump in there and clear this up for me. But looking at this for years and years, I've always been asking, like, to what end are we doing the critical analysis? And I think on the surface, people would be like, duh, Kurt, what's your deal, man? How do you not understand? This is about, getting rid of injustices. Sure. But if you're going to get rid of injustices, you got to get after things like, greed in all of its forms. I mean, there's no thriving if we're going to keep enacting greed, right? And I think people who are working on critical pedagogy, myself included, would say, like, keep going with this, keep going deeper and keep going deeper and keep going deeper. There's something there. And so that's kind of where I've gotten with this, is that when I've gotten there, it's that we have to call out the greed that's slowing us down, making us all have this very compromised living experience, and that stop chasing greed, right? Stop chasing money, this fabricated construct in our society. We need to change that, right? That's something that we can change, but we can't change that until we start to realize what the limitations are of this ideology, and to sort of what can be done in place of that. That's the thing that's always been missing for me. What can we do in place of that? And I don't think any one person has the answer to it, myself included. I would never want to spearhead this. This would be somebody else with better leadership and organizational skills than me, for sure. Okay? Anyway, where am I going with this? How does this affect a learning theory? Well, if you use this picture and kind of what I've said here as the frame, you see a difference, right? So the starting places don't change too much, I think, from critical constructivism. I think the starting places are more or less the same, maybe some variation, but And what the variation might be is at the very beginning asking ourselves, what do we think thriving is? Whereas I think critical is so heavily focused on what do we think injustice is, that you got to ask both questions, right? You got to ask them together. They have to be asked at the same time. So you have to, okay, what are the injustices, and what are the injustices keeping us from? And whatever that's from is your sort of source for what you think thriving even is. And I think that would happen in phase one, right? So there'd be somewhat of a difference, but you see, graphically here, I haven't created anything here that's really different in the beginning. So, you take all of that community-based understanding and your own understanding and experiences, and you explore that. You do all that really good work in phase one, and then you get to phase two. As I said before, you have your content, whatever is, being expected to be taught and to be learned. You do the critical analysis, just as I said before, but you have this shift, which really starts by incorporating one's path. And I want to clear this one up right away, okay? I don't think that anything is ever set in stone for us, but I think we do intuitively feel like there's a space for us to go down, to really differentiate, if you will, into our society. And, I've differentiated into the land of education, right? That's my path. Um, so I think it's really important to have a formal educational experience that connects to path. In a much more explicit and long-term way, and not just path in terms of how are you going to make money in life, and who you're going to be an employee for who. It's not that. It's more that we all have this greater sense of understanding of who we think we are, and the kind of, eventually, you see the word contribution there, the kind of contributions that we're going to be really good at making over time, which could change, right, as we get older too and go through various life stages. So the point here is, I think step one is we got to bring in individual path, and that's a big difference, I think, than critical constructivism. I've never really seen individual path be really deeply considered. There's some discussion around individuality and what that means, but it tends, I think, to be fairly limited, and I think it has been because individuality has been very greed oriented, and is sort of dominance oriented, and so it's hard to then step back from that and see how our individual paths are an important thing. And I'm going to say this is something that should always be in balance, and really reflexively thinking about its place, and what the relationships and impacts are. It's never something that should just be, hey, I'm going to do this because I feel like I need to do this. That's an irresponsible form of freedom there, right? It's not real freedom. It's just hurting people. It should always be or the earth, right, or hurting nature. It should always be something that's in concert with the greater communities and societies that one lives in. Certainly fine to keep pushing on a society so that it can grow and change and be a better society, though, too. Right? Anyway, so now what happens is we bridge that sort of community and content and analytical understandings through one's path, and we differentiate right there so that somebody can now start to, with their path in mind, start to work on some issues. And those issues of, I'm just calling them issues of thriving, but they can be the same kind of issues that critical pedagogy looks at: race, class, gender. Certainly, we could throw in other frames there: equal justice, nature, and so forth. But I think that the real big difference here is that learning is always continuing as it's being sort of deepened and coupled with our path, as we're reconnecting with the issues of thriving that's in our communities, and that could be a range of different kinds of communities, ranging from very, very local to very global, maybe someday sort of intergalactic, who knows, but the contribution side of it, once you're in the process of creating a contribution and then providing a contribution, you're still learning at that point, right? You don't stop learning about something. You're learning things in more detail and with more relationship in mind, with sort of the dynamics of what happens when you push and pull and look at it through, in the space of your community and all of that, right? So that's a lot of things going on there that don't continue with critical constructivism, and certainly don't continue with regular constructivism, cognitivism, or behaviorism, for sure. Okay, so if you look at learning, again, the endpoint shifts to somebody making contribution within their community. The learning is going to deepen, deepen, deepen all the way through to that experience. Okay, that's huge, right? And then sort of looking at how the community changes with that. So, okay, now, again, reapplying it to cellular biology, you see some similarities there, and I'm really just going to point out the things that are in yellow as the difference. So the philosophies are now for the purpose of becoming a scientifically literate community member whose work, who works to democratically, produce more thriving with others, right? The core teaching methods, they're going to now investigate more in their local community's views on cell-based issues, and they're also going to not just, because that in and of itself could just be sort of like a community-based critical constructivism, but this real shift here, tying those things together and putting it in the how do we thrive? What would our cellular communal health, public health look like? I think that gets us more towards this sort of thriving integrative constructivism. Okay, the core assessments, they're based on contribution, and our students providing something that's meaningful and contribution oriented. And then, of course, contribution itself is going to be the connections to the real world. Okay, so you have these 4 phases. You have the inquiry phase where we're looking into public health issues, because the goal here is to tie towards thriving at the end. So we're going to start with the end in mind, and then what are the issues and challenges, and what does thriving look like? It's phase 2, a real deep look into the content itself, and then phase with these issues in mind, keep connecting with the community still in phase 2, and in phase 3 we would have this sort of deep dive into a differentiated path where there's a lot more to discover. There's a lot more to learn. There's a lot more that's connected to community. There's let's take the sort of broader, abstract, or decontextualized understandings and go deeper, right? And then connecting it with one's path so that they can make a contribution, which leads into phase 4, okay? And if you see it sort of spread out over 20 school days, which would be, 4 weeks of school, you can sort of see how it plays out, right? And you can sort of scale it up or down based on how much time you're going to spend on something. I think we would actually spend probably close to 8 weeks on something like this at the middle school level, maybe 4 weeks with something like this, or less, right, at the high school level. Okay, so, but you get the point here, and I like I said, I really wanted to sort of point out there's and I think this is just the beginning, but there's some real differences between sort of just a critical, which has the ending at just sort of being aware of the power issues that are interlaced with that content. That's sort of the critical constructivist endpoint, more or less. Students can take it and become activists. They can, they can make contributions and so forth. But that's it's sort of seen where the stopping points are. And then you have the integrative, which is moving towards thriving altogether, right? It's how do we do this and actually making real contributions, and there, there you go. Okay. I hope that was helpful. Bye.